Hi, my name is ADS510. For this ADS510 presentation, we'll be discussing one of the most influential theories in international relations, the realism theory. To begin, imagine a world where countries act mainly to protect their own survival, power, and interests that will reflect the realist perspective of global politics. Realism is a dominant theory in the study of international relations. According to this theory, the international system is anarchic, which means there is no central authority above sovereign states. Realism believes that states are the main actors and they behave rationally to pursue national interests, especially power and security. Realists argue that conflict is unavoidable due to competition among states for limited resources and power. The foundation of realism goes back to the classical political thinkers like Thucydides, who described power struggle during the Peloponnesian War. In modern times, Hans Morgenthau, often called the father of realism, developed the classical realist theory, stating that international politics is governed by objective law rooted in human nature. He famously said, "International politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power." Even in today's world, realism is still relevant. For example, in the South China Sea dispute, countries like China, Malaysia, and the US prioritize their national security and territorial claims.
The Philippine Coast Guard issues radio challenges to a swarm of Chinese maritime militia ships loitering near Rosul Reef in the West Philippine Sea. The presence of these ships and the illegal patrols of Chinese Coast Guard vessels are hurting the livelihood of Filipino fishermen. Daryl Sarmiento reports.
A drone suspected to be owned by the Chinese Coast Guard was spotted at around 4 a.m. of June 16, Monday, circling Philippine Coast Guard ships approaching the Hasa-Hasa Shoal. Initially, it was barely recognizable given its size and the pitch-black sky. According to the Philippine Coast Guard, no PCG drone was deployed at that time, raising the possibility that the Chinese Coast Guard was conducting surveillance operations. At least 50 Chinese maritime militia vessels were also monitored at Rosal Reef, located in the West Philippine Sea. Rosal Reef is approximately 128 nautical miles from Palawan and falls within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. In response, the Philippine Coast Guard deployed BRP Cape San Agustin MRRV 4408, BRP Cape Engaño MRRV 4411, in an aircraft to assert the country's sovereign rights.
For the Coast Guard vessels and the Coast Guard aircraft, challenge natin ito through radio. We informed them that their presence, their irregular movement, and their swarming activities and anchoring activities do not conform itong freedom of navigation. And this kind of behavior basically violate our sovereign rights in our own exclusive economic zone. So we keep on challenging them to tell us their intention and to depart immediately. But unfortunately, sa dami ng Chinese maritime militia vessels na to, wala ni isa sa kanila ang nagresponde sa ating aircraft and even for the Philippine Coast Guard vessels.
Meanwhile, a group from the Palawan United Commercial Fishing Association Incorporated, which had just returned from Hasa-Hasa Shoal, shared their experience. According to the group's president, they often yield to Chinese vessels present in the West Philippine Sea to avoid any potential conflict.
Parang nasanay na rin sila kasi lagi na lang din doon ng Chinese Coast Guard, kaya parang sila na lang iwas kung saan banda kasi alam na rin nila yung ruta ng Chinese Coast Guard kung saan sila katulad ng Ayungin, sa Sabina, nandoon talaga sila laging naka-state.
Boat Captain Herminio Atay and his crew stayed at the Hasa-Hasa Shoal for a week and was able to haul in 1,000 kilos of yellowfin tuna amounting to 80,000 pesos ready to be transported to Metro Manila. Atay said to avoid Chinese forces from seeing them, they would fish in the middle of the pitch black night. At some point, he said, they feel like thieves in their own country.
Para hindi daw makakita nila ba, parang ganun, parang magnanakaw nga. Gabi na ang hanap buhay. Dapat sana, maganda sana kung wala yun sila. Kaya araw-gabi ang hanap buhay namin. Pero nandyan, masyadong mahirap.
Despite the fears and uncertainties of fishing in the West Philippine Sea, the Filipino fishermen persevere out of necessity and for the sake of their families.
Ay hindi maiwasan. Darating talagang ang takot, kaya lang tiis na. Kakayanin ang takot para lang ng daming nag-asa rin. So, mga anak namin, may pinaparal pa. Paano na lang kung takot ang pinairal namin?
The fishermen of Palawan are the beneficiaries of the payaw installation at Hasa-Hasa and Kanduli Shoal. According to them, each payaw could produce around 500 kilograms of fish. They added that if there were no Chinese vessels present in the area, they could catch even more fish and earn a better income. Daryl Sarmiento, ABS-CBN News.
Why countries act in their own interests, even within international organizations like the United Nations or ASEAN. In the context of Malaysia foreign policy, although we support diplomacy, we still invest in defense to protect sovereignty, a reflection of realist thinking. In conclusion, realism remains a key theoretical framework in understanding how states behave in the international system. It emphasizes that power, interest, and survival are the main motivation for state action. Now that we have covered the introduction, I will pass to the next presenter.
Today, I will presenting the main principle of realism in international relations, which is one of the most influential theory in the study of global politics. Here are the 4 main points.
All right, let's dive into one of the most fundamental ideas in international relations, state-centrism, in realist theory.
Realists argue that states are the most important actors in international politics. While international organizations like the United Nations do play roles, they are considered secondaries. In realism, the state is seen as a rational and unitary actor that makes decisions based on its own interests.
Alright, let's get real about one of the most important yet misunderstood ideas in international relations: anarchy in the international system.
This does not mean chaos, but rather it means that there is no central authority above states. There is no global government to enforce rules or ensure peace. Because of this, each state must look after its own survival, often leading to competition and rivalry.
Let's dive into the world of international relations. And trust me, this isn't just about politicians in suits. It's about the raw engine that drives every country's actions on the global stage. Today, I'm tackling two powerhouse concepts in realism: national interest and power.
Realists believe that states act mainly to protect their national interests, and this is usually defined in terms of power and security. Whether it is through building military strength or forming strategic alliance, states will always prioritize their own survival and influence in the international arena.
Full of people, each with their own goals, fears, and secrets. Now imagine the world stage is exactly like that room, but every person is a country.
Realists argue that humans are nationally selfish and power-driven, and this behavior is reflected in how states behave. Conflict, war, and competition are seen as inevitable outcomes in the international system because of this selfish nature.
Next, I'll be talking about realism in international relations, a theory that views the world as competitive and conflict-driven arena where states prioritize power and survival. Let's explore the four core principles of realism. First, let's look at the state-centrism. Realism emphasizes that the state is the most important actor in international politics. Unlike theories that highlight the role of international organizations like the United Nations or NGOs, realism sees these institutions as having limited power. Realists argue that the states are sovereign and responsible for making critical decisions about war, peace, alliance, and diplomacy. In other words, the state acts in its own interest regardless of what the international community may want. Next is anarchy in the international system. Realists believe that the global system lacks a central authority. There is no world government to enforce rules or prevent conflict, which creates an anarchy structure. Because of this, states operate in a self-help system where each country must depend on itself for survival. Cooperation is rare, and even if it happens, it doesn't usually last long because trust is minimal. The third key idea is national interest and power. Realists assume that states act rationally to protect and advance their national interests, especially in terms of security and power. This causes competition among countries, leading to arms race and efforts to balance power. For example, if one state grows stronger, others will respond by building their own military strength. every state wants to protect itself and increase its influence. Now, let's talk about the pessimistic view of human nature. Realists believe that human beings are naturally selfish and power-seeking. This idea is reflected in how states behave, always focusing on gaining more power. Because of this, conflict and war are seen as unavoidable. Even when countries engage in diplomacy or cooperation, realism argues that it's just temporary. Eventually, power struggle will come back. To summarize, realism in international relations is built on four main ideas. The state is central, the international system is anarchy, states act based on power and national interests, and conflict is expected due to a pessimistic view of human nature. Understanding realism helps us see why cooperation is difficult and why states often prioritize their own survival and strength above all else.
Hello everyone. Okay, cut to the chase. We talk about impact. So point number one for impact is international conflict and war. Realism helps us to understand why war keep happening even countries say they want peace. At its core, realism believes that every country is mainly focused on one thing. It means its own survival and national interest. Because of this, countries do not fully trust each other even when peace talk happen. Each country is always watching out for its own safety and power. So war happens not necessarily because leader want it, but because they feel they must protect their interests, sometimes with force. So point number two is arm race and military build up. As realism theories say that a strong military is essential for country to survive in dangerous world. So as a result, country compete to build more weapon. This is called an arm race. Okay, for example, if one country build more missile, its neighbor might do the same to avoid falling behind. This creates a cycle. More weapon, more tension. But from a realism view, it's seen as necessary for protection. So point number three is limited role of international institution. Realism is skeptical about international group like the UN, United Nations, or treaties like international law. Why? Because according to realism, this organization does not have real power to enforce rule. If powerful country break a rule, who's going to stop them? Realism believe that in the end, countries will ignore those rules if their survival is at stake. No matter what international law say. Okay, for example, US invasion of Iraq is 2003. The US invaded Iraq without full approval from the UN. So the UN claiming Iraq has weapon for mass destruction. Despite protection from the UN and the other country. So So the US act alone. So that's means showing how powerful state may bypass international law when they feel it's in their interest. So for point number 4 is power politic dominate diplomacy. In realism, the diplomacy is not about trust or peace. It's about strategy and advantage. So country make deal not because they trust each other, but because it help them gain power or avoid danger. Realism believe that there's little trust in international politics and countries always thinking about what it for me. So peace talk, alliance and negotiation are seen as a part of bigger power game, not idealism. So to sum up, realism explains global politics as a world where power, self-interest and survival come first. Even peace effort, diplomacy and international law are shaped by this thought reality. That's all for me.
To summarize, realism is a theory in international relations that views the world as a competitive, conflict-prone arena dominated by sovereign states. With its state-centric anarchic worldview, it asserts that national interests and power are the driving forces of international behavior. Coupled with a pessimistic view of human nature, realism paints a picture of a global system where conflict is inevitable and cooperation is always fragile. Though sometimes criticized for its cynical outlook, realism remains a realistic lens through which many global events and power struggles can be understood.